$35. It was the price of a ghost, or maybe the cost of burying one. For Jasper Thorne, it was both. That was all he had left in the world, a few worn coins and a thirst for silence that the whiskey couldn't quench anymore. He'd paid the money to a faceless clerk in a dusty territorial office for a deed to a place he'd never seen, a patch of sun-blistered earth in the heart of the Arizona desert. The clerk had called it a ranch. Jasper called it an ending. He wasn't looking for a fortune. Fortunes were for men who still had something to buy. He was a man running from the sound of his own name, from the memory of a wife's laughter and a child's cry that had been stolen from him by the kind of violence that leaves a man hollow. The ghosts didn't ride behind him. They rode inside him, their whispers louder than any prairie wind. This land, this forgotten scrap of nowhere, was supposed to be quiet enough to finally let them sleep. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the cracked, thirsty ground. His horse, a weary roan named Dust, plodded onward, its head low. For miles, there had been nothing but bleached rock, and the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti reaching for a merciless sky. Then, he saw it, a dark line on the horizon, not a mountain, but a structure. The ranch. As he drew closer, the word ranch felt like a cruel joke. It was a skeleton, just like everything else out here. A main house with a slumped spine of a roof, a barn that looked like a stiff breeze could turn it to splinters, and a perimeter fence that was little more than a suggestion of a boundary. It was a tombstone for a dream he'd never truly had, a perfect place to disappear. He guided Dust toward the main gate, a simple arch of weathered timber that must have once held a proud sign. But as the structure came into focus through the shimmering heat, a cold knot coiled in Jasper's stomach. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. 3 shapes hung from the crossbeam of the gate. At first, his mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. They swayed in the hot, listless wind, their movement unnatural, a grotesque pendulum marking a time that had already stopped. They weren't sacks. They weren't animal carcasses left as a warning. It wasn't wood. It wasn't metal. It was flesh. Jasper pulled Dust to a halt, his hand instinctively resting on the butt of the Colt Peacemaker at his hip. The silence of the desert rushed in, vast and absolute. He swung down from the saddle, his boots crunching on the gravel, each step a thunderclap in the stillness. He approached the gate, the knot in his stomach tightening into a block of ice. They were girls, Apache girls, their traditional dresses torn and stained with dust, their black hair matted against faces etched with the suffering he knew all too well. They couldn't have been much older than 20, the youngest maybe 16. Ropes, thick and cruel, were cinched tight around their necks, digging into their sun-darkened skin. Their feet dangled inches from the ground, a final, brutal insult. He had seen death before. He had stared it in the face, dealt it with his own hands, and held it in his arms as it stole the ones he loved. But this was different. This wasn't the swift violence of a gunfight. This was a slow, agonizing spectacle. This was a message, written in the language of pure hatred. He reached the gate, his throat tight with a rage he thought he had buried long ago. He looked at their faces, expecting the vacant stare of the dead. But then he saw it. A flicker. In the youngest girl, a slight tremor in her fingers. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his chest. A faint, almost imperceptible puff of air escaped her cracked lips. Then he saw it in the second one, and the third. They were alive. The world narrowed to the ropes, the dust, and the 3 shallow breaths that stood between life and death. In that instant, 8 years of running, of hiding inside himself, of letting the world burn, it all fell away. The ghosts inside him didn't whisper. They screamed. They screamed a warning of what happens when a good man does nothing. He had failed his family once. He would not fail these strangers. His hand didn't shake as he drew the long blade of his Bowie knife. The steel felt familiar, an extension of an older, harder version of himself he thought he'd left behind. He didn't think. He didn't weigh the consequences. There was no choice to be made. One cut. The rope snapped, and the first girl's body slumped forward. He caught her, the weight of her a shock, so fragile and light. He laid her gently in the shade of the gatepost. A second cut. He caught the next girl, her head falling against his shoulder. A third. The last rope fell away, and with it, the last tie to the man who had ridden up to this gate seeking only an empty grave. He stood there for a moment, the three women lying at his feet, the desert wind whispering around them. He looked at his $35 ranch, at the gallows that served as its welcome. The promise of peace was dead, but in its place, 3 lives flickered, refusing to follow. And Jasper Thorne, a man who had come here to die, knew his war had just begun. What Jasper Thorne found at that gate was a horror beyond imagination. If you're enjoying this story so far, hit that like button, comment the number 1 down below, and subscribe to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support is the fuel that keeps these Wild West stories coming. Now, let's see what happens when a man who has lost everything is forced to make a choice. He stood there for a moment, the 3 women lying at his feet, the desert wind whispering around them. He looked at his $35 ranch, at the gallows that served as its welcome. The promise of peace was dead, but in its place, 3 lives flickered, refusing to follow. And Jasper Thorne, a man who had come here to die, knew his war had just begun. There was no time for thought, only for action. He moved by instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through colder nights and bloodier fights than this. He hoisted the first girl, the youngest one, into his arms. She was lighter than a sack of feed, a collection of sharp angles and fragile bones that spoke of hardship and hunger. He carried her through the groaning door of the main house, his boots kicking up clouds of dust that had lain undisturbed for years. The inside was worse than the outside. It smelled of decay and abandonment. Cobwebs hung like funeral shrouds from the rafters, and the furniture was draped in white cloths, making the room look like a morgue for forgotten memories. He kicked a sheet off a crude cot in the corner and laid her down gently, her head lolled to the side, her breathing a shallow, ragged whisper. One by one, he brought the others inside. Each trip was a fresh confrontation with the brutality inflicted upon them. The second girl had a deep gash on her forehead, matted with blood and dirt. The third, the oldest, had hands that were raw and bleeding, as if she'd fought with the fury of a cornered animal. He laid them side by side on the dusty floorboards near the great stone hearth, the only thing in the house that looked solid, the only thing that looked like it could endure. He worked with a grim efficiency. He found a bucket and drew water from the well out back, the water surprisingly cool and clear. He ripped a strip from one of the dust cloths, finding a section that was relatively clean, and soaked it. He returned to the hearth and knelt beside them. Gently, as if tending to a wounded bird, he began to wipe the grime from their faces. He cleaned the cut on the second girl's brow, his touch surprisingly steady. He saw the deep, purpled welts the ropes had left around their necks, raw and angry. A wave of cold fury washed over him, so intense it almost made him dizzy. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't war. This was something fouler. This was the work of men who enjoyed breaking things just to watch them fall apart. He uncorked his canteen and dripped a few drops of water onto the youngest girl's lips. She stirred, a faint moan escaping her throat, and her tongue darted out to catch the moisture. He did the same for the others, a slow, painstaking process. Life, he thought, was a stubborn thing. It clung to the edges, fighting for one more breath, one more heartbeat. With a pile of dry kindling he'd found near the barn, he coaxed a small flame to life in the cavernous hearth. The fire crackled, spitting embers, and for the first time, a flicker of warmth and life pushed back against the tomb-like chill of the house. The flames danced, casting long, wavering shadows across the room, turning the 3 sleeping forms into dark, still shapes. And then, the work was done. There was nothing more he could do for them, except wait. Jasper backed away from the hearth and sank into a splintered wooden chair, the wood groaning under his weight. The adrenaline that had fueled him since he'd seen them on the gate began to fade, replaced by a cold, heavy dread. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, a steady rhythm in the suffocating quiet. Each pop and hiss was a question. What have you done, Thorn? He had ridden into this valley seeking an escape, a place so empty it would finally quiet the ghosts. For $35, he had bought himself a clean slate, a final chapter written in silence. But with 3 cuts of his knife, he had torn that deed to shreds. He hadn't just saved 3 women. He had inherited their trouble. He had painted a target on the door of his sanctuary. He looked at them, their faces softened in the firelight. Strangers. He knew nothing about them, not their names, not their people, not the sin they had committed to earn such a punishment. But he knew the men who had done this to them. He didn't know their faces, but he knew their kind. Men who mistake cruelty for strength. Men for whom power is the only god they worship. And they were not the kind of men to leave a job unfinished. The devil who'd hung them up would be back to check his work. A familiar, bitter taste rose in his throat. It was the taste of failure. He had seen a look like that before, the resigned terror on a woman's face. He'd seen it on his wife, Sarah, in the moment before the bandits' fire had torn their world apart. He had stood by, frozen for a fatal second, and in that second, he had lost everything. His failure had been a shadow he could never outrun, a debt he could never repay. He had run for 8 years, trying to leave the man who had failed his family in the dust behind him. Now, fate, in its cruel wisdom, had dealt him the same hand again. 3 lives, hanging by a thread, placed squarely in his care. The choice was simple. He could get back on dust. He could ride away and never look back. He could leave the women here. Maybe they'd live. Maybe they'd die. It wouldn't be his problem. He could keep running, find another forgotten corner of the world, and try again to bury himself. It was the smart thing to do. It was the only way to survive. But as he looked at the girl with the cut on her forehead, her brow furrowed in a pained sleep, he saw his daughter, Emily. He saw the trust that should have been in the world, the innocence that men like him were supposed to protect. To leave them now would be more than an act of self-preservation. It would be a verdict. It would be the final admission that the man who had been Jasper Thorne, the husband, the father, the protector, was truly dead and gone, and only the hollowed-out shell remained. It would mean that Sarah and Emily had died for nothing. The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sound pulled him from the mire of his memory. He pushed himself out of the chair, his joints aching. He walked to the door and peered out into the deepening twilight. The desert was turning shades of purple and orange, beautiful and deadly. Somewhere out there, they were coming. He knew it with a certainty that settled deep in his bones. He closed the heavy oak door and slid the thick iron bolt into place. It was a futile gesture, he knew. A wooden door wouldn't stop the kind of evil that was on its way. But it was a start. He wasn't running anymore. He didn't know if he was fighting for them, or for himself, or for the ghosts that deserved a better man. Maybe it didn't matter. He was fighting. For the first time in 8 years, he was choosing to stand his ground. He had bought himself a tomb, but tonight, he would make it a fortress. Jasper has made his choice, bolting the door against the coming evil. But is it bravery or a fool's errand? Comment the number 2 and tell me, was he right to stay? The ghosts of his past are watching, and the real enemy hasn't even shown his face yet. He had bought himself a tomb, but tonight, he would make it a fortress. The night was long. Jasper didn't sleep. He sat in the worn wooden chair, his Winchester rifle resting across his lap, and watched the fire burn down to glowing embers. He listened. He listened to the breathing of the 3 women, a fragile chorus that was the only proof of life in the silent house. He listened to the desert outside, to the howl of a distant coyote and the rustle of unseen critters in the scrub. Every sound was a potential threat. Every shadow was a phantom with a gun. He was a different man than the one who had ridden in yesterday, seeking only to be left alone. That man was a ghost. Tonight, he was a watchman. He felt the old instincts stirring, the sharp-edged awareness that had kept him alive in the war and through the hard years that followed. He was no stranger to vigils like this, waiting for an enemy that could come with the sunrise or with the snap of a twig in the dead of night. Dawn arrived not with a bang, but with a whisper. A pale gray light began to seep through the grimy windows, slowly pushing the darkness into the corners of the room. It painted the desert outside in shades of ash and bone, a cold, unforgiving light. A sound from the floor pulled his attention. A soft gasp. It was the youngest one, the girl he had carried in first. Her eyes fluttered open, wide and dark with a terror so profound it was like looking into a deep well. They darted around the unfamiliar room, saw the strange, bearded man in the chair with a rifle, and the terror solidified into pure panic. She tried to scramble backward, a raw cry catching in her throat, but her body was too weak. Jasper didn't move. He kept his voice low, the words soft. "Easy now. You're safe." He held up his empty hands slowly, keeping the rifle on his lap. "I'm not going to hurt you. I found you. Outside. I brought you in." The girl, Cora, stared at him, her chest heaving. She looked at her sisters, still unconscious beside her, and a fresh wave of fear crossed her face. Just then, the second sister stirred, Amia. She came to with a jolt, her body tensing as she took in the scene. Her eyes, unlike her younger sisters, held not just fear, but a spark of pure defiance. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her gaze locking onto Jasper with a protective glare that was as sharp as any blade. "Who are you?" she rasped, her voice a dry crackle. "What is this place?" "My name is Jasper Thorne," he answered simply. "This is my ranch. Or it is now, I reckon." Before more could be said, a third voice cut through the tension, weak but clear. "Cora. Amia. Be still." It was the eldest, Lyda. She was the last to wake, and she did so with a quiet grace that belied the horror she had endured. She sat up slowly, her movements deliberate, her eyes missing nothing. They weren't filled with panic or anger. They were ancient, holding a universe of sorrow and a core of unbreakable steel. She looked at Jasper, at the bolted door, at the dying fire, at the clean cloths, and the bucket of water. She was reading the story of the last few hours, and in her gaze, Jasper felt himself being weighed and measured. He met her stare, holding it. In that silent exchange, a decision was made. Lyda finally turned her attention to her sisters, speaking to them in the soft, flowing words of their Apache tongue. Her voice was a comfort, and slowly, the tension in the room began to ease. Cora stopped trembling. Amia relaxed her rigid posture, though her eyes never left Jasper. After a long moment, Lyda looked back at him. "You cut us down." It wasn't a question. "I did," Jasper said. "Why?" It was a simple word, but it held the weight of the world. Why would a white man, a stranger, risk his life for 3 Apache women he found hanging from a gate? Jasper didn't have a simple answer. He thought of Sarah. He thought of Emily. He thought of 8 years of running. "Because no one," he said, his voice rough with emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years, "deserves to die like that." Lyda held his gaze for another long moment, searching for the lie. When she found none, she gave a slow, solemn nod. She accepted his reason, and with that acceptance, she began to speak, her English careful and precise. "This place you call a ranch," she began, her voice gaining a little strength. "It has a name. Our people call it Ndanjwef, the land of living water. It has been the heart of our tribe for more generations than there are stars in the sky." She explained that beneath the dry, cracked earth of this very ranch ran a secret spring, a source of underground water so pure and plentiful that it never ran dry, even in the worst droughts. It was their lifeblood, their most sacred secret. "Then he came," she said, and a shadow passed over her face, so dark it seemed to suck the light from the room. "A man named Elias Vance, a man whose soul is as dry as the desert, and just as greedy. He heard whispers of the living water, and he wanted it for himself." Her voice trembled, But she did not stop. She told him everything. Vance had come with smiles and promises, offering treaties and trade. But it was a lie. When their elders refused to sell the land, to reveal the source of their life, Vance had returned with fire and death. He and his hired men, led by a monster named Malachi Kane, had descended upon their village in the dead of night. They burned their homes, they slaughtered their men, their elders, even the children. They took everything. "We are all that is left," Lyda whispered, and now tears tracked clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "My sisters and I, we escaped the burning, but we could not leave our heritage behind." From a small leather pouch tied around her neck, she carefully pulled out a folded piece of tanned hide. It was brittle with age, covered in markings that made no sense to Jasper. Amia and Cora did the same, each producing a similar piece. "The map to the living water," Lyda explained, her voice hardening. "Our ancestors were wise. They split it into 3 pieces, one for each daughter of the chief's line. It can only be read when all 3 are brought together. This is what Vance wants. Not the land, the water. With it, he can control this entire territory." A terrible understanding began to dawn on Jasper. "That's why he kept you alive," he said, the words tasting like ash. Lyda nodded, her eyes locking onto his. "He did not hang us to kill us," she said, and the cruelty of it struck Jasper like a physical blow. "Not yet. He hung us as bait. A trap." She explained that Vance and his men were watching. They had left them there to die slowly, to see who would come. Would it be a friend of their people, coming to help? Or would it be a rival, a traitor, greedy enough to cut down 3 dying women to steal the map pieces from their bodies? Either way, Vance's men would have their prize and eliminate a threat. He wanted to see who still had courage in this valley. Lyda finished, her voice a ghost of a whisper. He wanted to see who was still foolish enough to choose compassion over fear. Jasper stared at the 3 pieces of hide, the legacy of a murdered people. He looked at the 3 sisters, the last survivors of a forgotten nation. He had walked right into the devil's snare. His $35 hadn't bought him a ranch. It had bought him a front-row seat to a massacre, and by cutting those ropes, he had just announced to the monster in the shadows exactly what kind of man he was. The secret is out. A map, a murdered tribe, and a hidden spring. The stakes are higher than Jasper could have ever dreamed. If this story has you hooked, please take a moment to like and subscribe. It truly helps the channel grow. Now, comment the number 3 if you think this secret is worth dying for, because the men who want it are on their way. Jasper stared at the 3 pieces of hide, the legacy of a murdered people. He looked at the 3 sisters, the last survivors of a forgotten nation. He had walked right into the devil's snare. His $35 hadn't bought him a ranch. It had bought him a front-row seat to a massacre. And by cutting those ropes, he had just announced to the monster in the shadows exactly what kind of man he was. The sun climbed higher, relentless, burning away the last of the night's chill. Jasper stood at the single grimy window of the ranch house, his rifle cradled in his arms. The desert stretched out, deceptively peaceful. But he knew better. The quiet out here wasn't empty. It was waiting. It was holding its breath. He listened to the low, hushed voices of the 3 women behind him. Lyda was speaking softly to her sisters, her voice a balm. Cora coughed, a dry, racking sound. Amia was watching him, her gaze intense, assessing. He felt the weight of their fragile lives, a burden heavier than any saddlebag. Then, he saw it. A shimmer on the distant horizon, growing steadily larger. A cloud of dust, churning up from the parched earth. And then, the riders. A dozen of them, maybe more, moving with the brutal precision of men on a mission. Their rifles glinted in the sunlight. They weren't farmers. They weren't prospectors. They were predators. Malachi Kane. Lyda's words echoed in his mind. The devil's right hand. Jasper turned from the window. "They're here," he said, his voice flat. No need to soften it. These women knew what danger looked like. Lyda nodded, her eyes losing none of their steel. Crowley, she corrected, using the name her people knew him by. He comes with the hunger of a wolf. Malachi Kane, or Crowley, as the Apache called him. It didn't matter. Names were just labels for the same kind of evil. The riders pulled up short of the gate, forming a grim semicircle. They were a motley crew of hard-faced men, hardened by violence, wearing the mismatched gear of hired guns. At their head was a man on a black horse, a figure of lean, coiled menace. His face was a mask of cold indifference, his eyes like chips of flint. This was Kane. This was the man who'd hung 3 women to die. He dismounted slowly, letting his gaze sweep over the dilapidated ranch house, a chilling arrogance in his posture. He was taking his time, enjoying the spectacle, making sure they knew exactly who held the power here. He hadn't bothered to bring the map pieces, because he believed they were as good as his already. Then, his voice, a low rumble that carried across the quiet desert, reached the house. It wasn't loud, but it was edged with a casual cruelty that made the hair on Jasper's arms stand on end. "Rancher," Kane called out. "I know you're in there. I know what you found." Jasper didn't answer. He stood firm, rifle ready. Kane took a few steps forward, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He stopped just beyond the gate, his hands resting on his hips. He was a man utterly devoid of conscience. "Listen close, old man," Kane continued, his voice dripping with condescension. "You've made a mistake. A big one. This isn't your fight. It never was. These squaws." He spat the word like poison. "They belong to Elias Vance. So does whatever trinkets they're carrying." Jasper's grip tightened on his rifle. The familiar rage, cold and sharp, began to simmer in his gut. "You got 2 choices," Kane said, extending a hand, palm up, as if offering a simple bargain. "You hand 'em over. The women, and whatever maps, or jewels, or whatever cursed Indian magic they carry. You do that, and you ride away. You forget you ever saw this place. Forget you ever saw us. You live." He paused, letting his words hang in the hot air. His eyes narrowed, and the casual cruelty in his voice sharpened into a direct threat. "Or," he continued, "you don't. You try to play hero, and when I come back, this whole damn ranch burns. Every stick of wood, every blade of dry grass. And you, and those 3 worthless creatures, you burn with it. This won't be a fight, old man. It'll be a slaughter." A long silence settled over the desert, broken only by the uneasy shifting of the horses. The heat was oppressive. Inside the house, Cora let out a small, terrified whimper. Amia instinctively put an arm around her, glaring at the door as if her anger alone could stop the men outside. Lyda stepped forward, her frail frame surprisingly defiant. She met Jasper's gaze, her dark eyes pleading with a silent intensity. Not for her life, for something more. For justice. For the last spark of hope for her people. She didn't beg. She simply looked at him, and in that look, Jasper saw all the pain she carried, all the death she had witnessed, and all the desperate courage that still burned within her. He looked back at Kane, at the impassive faces of his men. He thought of his $35, of the dream of silence. He thought of Sarah's face, of Emily's soft hair. He had run from violence. He had run from choice. He had run from the man he was supposed to be. And then, in that moment, the running stopped. He pushed the rifle's safety off with a soft click, a sound that roared like thunder in the silent house. He raised the Winchester, slowly, deliberately, until its barrel was aimed squarely at the figure of Malachi Kane. "You tell Elias Vance," Jasper's voice rang out, strong and clear, cutting through the desert air like a whip crack. It was the voice of a man who had found his purpose again, a voice that had been buried under years of grief and regret. "You tell him this land ain't for sale. And these women, they ain't going anywhere." Kane's face, which had been impassive moments before, twisted into a snarl of pure fury. His eyes, cold as flint, blazed with disbelief. He had expected fear. He had expected surrender, not defiance. You got one day, old man, Kane snarled, his voice raw with menace. Just one day. Tomorrow, when the sun is high, I'm coming back. And I'm bringing hell with me. He turned on his heel, mounted his black horse, and without another word, he led his men away, disappearing back into the shimmering heat haze from which they had emerged. The dust cloud they left behind hung in the air, a choking reminder of the threat. The silence that followed was even heavier than before, filled not with peace, but with the terrifying promise of a coming storm. Jasper lowered his rifle, but his grip remained tight. He looked at Lita. Her eyes, though still filled with sorrow, held something new now. A flicker of surprise, and something that looked like gratitude. His $35 hadn't bought him peace. It had bought him a war. And he, Jasper Thorne, was finally ready to fight it. One day. That's all they have before hell itself comes knocking. Jasper has drawn his line in the sand. Which side would you be on? Comment the number 4 and let us know. Would you fight or would you run? The clock is ticking, and Malachi Kane always keeps his promises. His $35 hadn't bought him peace. It had bought him a war. And he, Jasper Thorne, was finally ready to fight it. The 24 hours Kane had given them were not a reprieve. They were a countdown, a clock, ticking with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a hangman's march. The desert, which had once promised solitude, now felt like a cage, and they could feel the eyes of the predators on them. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, menacing shadows across the valley, Jasper saw them. Small, dark shapes on the distant ridges, barely visible against the darkening rock. Scouts. Kane had left them behind, watchers to make sure their prey didn't bolt. They were a constant, silent reminder that the threat was not gone. It was merely waiting for the appointed hour. There was no time for rest. There was work to be done. The windows, Jasper said, his voice a low command. We need to board them up, all but a few slits to shoot from. He found a pile of old weathered planks in the collapsing barn, the wood as dry as bone. He worked with a feverish intensity, prying them loose, his muscles protesting. The women, weak as they were, refused to be idle. Lita, her hands still raw, helped him measure the wood. Amia, her defiant spirit channeled into furious energy, found a rusty hammer and a handful of bent nails. Even Cora, her face still pale with fear, gathered the tools, her small hands trembling but steady. They worked together in a strange, unspoken rhythm. The sound of the hammer against wood was the only sound, a desperate drumbeat against the encroaching silence. They weren't strangers anymore. They were a crew, their survival bound together by a shared enemy. As darkness fell, a new kind of tension settled over the ranch. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every shadow seemed to hold a man with a gun. They barred the door, pushed a heavy, rickety table against it, and took up positions in the darkness of the house. The attack, when it came, wasn't the full frontal assault they expected. It was something more insidious. A flicker of orange light from the direction of the barn caught Jasper's eye. He swore under his breath, peering through a crack in the boarded-up window. Flames were licking up the side of the old structure, hungry and fast. They're trying to smoke us out, he growled. Draw us into the open. Let it burn, Lita said, her voice surprisingly calm. There is nothing in there worth our lives. So they watched as the old barn, a skeleton already, was consumed by fire. The flames roared into the night sky, a funeral pyre for Jasper's brief, imagined peace. It was a message. We can touch you whenever we want. The night passed in a tense, sleepless vigil. They took turns watching, 2 hours on, 2 hours off. In the quiet moments between the fear, they talked. Jasper, who hadn't spoken of his past in 8 years, found himself telling them about his farm in Ohio, about a wife who loved the smell of rain, and a daughter with eyes the color of the summer sky. He spoke of the raid, the fire, the failure, The words came out rusty and broken, but for the first time, he wasn't speaking to ghosts. He was speaking to survivors. In return, Lida spoke of her people. She told him of the living water, of the ceremonies and songs that honored it. She spoke of her father, the chief, a man of peace who was murdered for his wisdom. Amia spoke of her skill with a bow, a fierce pride in her voice. Cora, shyly, spoke of the herbs she knew, the ones that could heal and the ones that could poison. They shared what little food. Jasper had a handful of dried beans and a strip of jerky each, and it felt like a feast. In the flickering firelight, they were no longer a white man and 3 Apache women. They were just 4 people, huddled together against a world that wanted them dead. Dawn brought no relief. It brought a new horror. When Jasper went to the well to draw water, he found the rope cut, the bucket lying at the bottom, just out of reach. Another message. We can make you thirsty. We can make you suffer. But the cruelest blow came an hour later. Jasper's horse, Dust, the last living link to his old life, had been tethered behind the house. He went to check on him and found the roan lying on its side, a single, clean knife wound in its heart. The horse's eyes were open, staring blankly at the sky. The senseless brutality of it hit Jasper harder than the fire, harder than the cut rope. It was personal. It was a final, vicious severing of his past. He knelt beside his faithful companion, his hand resting on the still warm flank, and a profound, aching sorrow filled him. He felt a small hand on his shoulder. It was Cora. She said nothing, but in her dark eyes, he saw a shared understanding of loss. Amia and Lida stood behind her, their faces grim. This act of cruelty hadn't broken their spirit. It had hardened it. It had forged their shared grief into a single, sharp point of resolve. He will pay for this, Amia hissed, her voice like the flick of a snake's tongue. Jasper rose to his feet. The sorrow was still there, but beneath it, something else was taking root. A cold, hard certainty. He had nothing left to lose now. They had taken his peace. They had taken his past. They would not take his future. He spent the rest of the morning with the women, not just preparing for a defense, but for a fight. He took out his spare Colt and showed Amia how to load and fire it. Her hands were steady, her aim surprisingly true. He showed Lida how to reload the Winchester, her movements quick and efficient. He showed them how to use cover, how to anticipate an enemy's move, and they, in turn, taught him. They showed him how to read the dust, to tell the difference between the track of a deer and the track of a man. They taught him which plants in the desert held water, which could be used to create a blinding smoke. They sharpened sticks into deadly spears, their knowledge of survival, a weapon far older than his gunpowder. In the crucible of that last day, under the shadow of death, a family was born. It was a strange, patchwork family, forged in fear and bonded by a common enemy. The rickety ranch house, once a tomb, had become a home, and they would defend it. Together, they are no longer strangers. They are a family forged in fire and fear. But can 4 people, armed with courage and little else, truly stand against an army? We love that you're here with us. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe to join our Western family. Now, comment the number 5 if you believe they have a fighting chance, because their time is almost up. In the crucible of that last day, under the shadow of death, a family was born. It was a strange, patchwork family, forged in fear and bonded by a common enemy. The rickety ranch house, once a tomb, had become a home, and they would defend it. Together, the sun began its final, merciless climb toward noon, the hour of Cain's return. The air grew thick and still, the heat a physical weight. Jasper checked his rifle for the 10th time. Amia sat by a slit in the boarded-up window, the Colt resting on the sill, her knuckles white. Lida and Cora were in the back, silent and ready. The house was a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Every minute stretched into an eternity. Hope had become a luxury they could no longer afford. There was only the grim reality of the fight to come, 4 against a dozen, maybe more. It wasn't a battle for victory. It was a battle for a good death. Then, a new dust cloud appeared on the horizon. But this one was different. It wasn't the wide, churning plume of a dozen riders. It was a single rider, moving at a steady, unhurried pace. Not the gait of a man coming for a fight. Jasper watched him through a crack in the boards, his finger resting on the trigger. The rider wasn't one of Cain's men. He was older, broad-shouldered, and on his chest, a glint of tin caught the sun. A star. "It's the law," Jasper said, his voice a low growl of disbelief. The law had been an abstraction out here, a distant rumor from a world that had long since forgotten this patch of desert. The rider stopped his horse a respectable distance from the gate, the same gate where the women had been hanging just 2 days before. He raised a hand, palm open, a universal sign of peace. "Jasper Thorne," the man called out, his voice deep and weathered, carrying the authority of a man used to being heard. "My name is Sheriff Gideon Cole. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. I'm here to stop it." Jasper exchanged a look with Lyda. Her eyes were narrowed with a deep, ingrained suspicion, and he couldn't blame her. The law of the white man had never been a friend to her people. "How do we know you're not with them?" Jasper yelled back, his rifle still trained on the man. "Because," the sheriff called, his voice steady, "I've been hunting Elias Vance for 5 years, and I think you 4 might be the key to finally putting a rope around his neck." It was a hell of a gamble. Opening the door could be a trick, a final, clever trap, but staying locked inside was a death sentence either way. Jasper looked at Lyda. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "Trust him. For now." Jasper unbarred the door and stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held low but ready. The sheriff dismounted and walked toward him, his movements slow and deliberate. He was a man etched by the sun and the hard life of the frontier, his face a roadmap of tough choices and long nights. But his eyes were clear and direct. They were the eyes of an honest man. "Heard you bought this place," Cole said, stopping a few feet away. "Got yourself a hell of a welcome." "You could say that," Jasper replied dryly. The sheriff's gaze drifted past Jasper to the figures of the 3 women who had emerged into the doorway behind him. He removed his hat, a gesture of respect that was so unexpected it was startling. "Ma'am," he said, nodding to Lyda, "I know who you are. I know what happened to your people, and I've been trying to prove it for a long, long time." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book, a ledger. He held it out for Jasper to see. "This," Sheriff Cole said, his voice low and intense, "is Vance's downfall." He opened the book. The pages were filled with neat, precise columns of names, dates, and numbers. It was a meticulously kept record of pure evil. "I got this from a clerk on his payroll. A man who finally grew a conscience," Cole explained. "It's all in here. Every payment to Malachi Cain and his dogs. Payments for Indian removal. Payments for burning a village. Payments for poisoning wells." He pointed to a specific entry. "Right here. A bonus. Paid for the capture of the daughters of the chief." The words hung in the air, a formal, written confirmation of the horror they had lived. It was proof. Hard, undeniable proof that would stand up in any court. "Vance is too powerful in this territory," the sheriff continued. "He owns the local judges, the local marshals. But this ledger, along with your testimony," he looked directly at Lyda, "it's enough to bring him before a federal judge in Red Mesa. It's enough to tear his whole empire down." A flicker of something long dormant sparked in Lyda's eyes. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something harder. It was the possibility of justice. "The white man's court did not help my father," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Why should we believe it will help us?" "Because your father didn't have this book," Cole answered, his gaze unwavering. "And he didn't have a witness like Mr. Thorne here. Vance built his world on lies and fear. This ledger is the truth, and the truth, ma'am, can be a powerful weapon if you've got the courage to wield it." The choice was theirs, to stay and fight a battle they would almost certainly lose, or to make a run for Red Mesa, to place their faith in a system that had always betrayed them, but now offered a single, desperate chance. Lida looked at her sisters. She looked at the desolate ranch that had once been her vibrant home. And she looked at Jasper, the stranger who had become their protector. "We will testify," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound resolve. "Not for your laws, but for our people, for my father. We will see him answer for what he has done." A grim smile touched Sheriff Cole's lips. "Good. Kane is due back here any minute. My guess is he'll bring his whole crew. We can't fight them here. We need to ride." "Now," Jasper nodded, his own decision already made. This was no longer just his fight for survival. It was bigger than that. It was a fight for the memory of the dead, and for the future of the living. "I'm with them," Jasper said, his voice solid as stone. "All the way to Red Mesa." The sheriff nodded, putting his hat back on. "Then saddle up, because we're about to ride straight through the devil's shadow." The promise of justice had arrived, but it came with a price. They had to survive long enough to claim it. A sheriff, a ledger, and a sliver of hope. But Red Mesa is a long ride away, and Kane's army is just over the ridge. Do they risk it all on a desperate run? Comment the number 6 and tell me what you would do. The next move they make will determine everything. "Then saddle up," the sheriff said, "because we're about to ride straight through the devil's shadow." The promise of justice had arrived, but it came with a price. They had to survive long enough to claim it. There was no time. The word "saddle up" was a bitter irony. Jasper's only horse lay dead behind the house. They had the sheriff's mount, but that was all. Their escape on horseback was impossible. The fortress Jasper had built was now their only chance. "We're not running," Jasper said, his voice hard as granite. "We're making our stand right here." Sheriff Cole looked at the boarded-up house, at the determined faces of the women, and at the grim set of Jasper's jaw. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man of the frontier. He knew a hopeless fight when he saw one, and he also knew when men had no choice but to see it through. He gave a single, sharp nod. "All right, Thorne. We'll give 'em hell." They didn't have to wait long. The dust cloud that appeared this time was different. It was bigger, darker, a roiling testament to the fury that was coming their way. Kane had kept his promise. He wasn't just bringing a dozen men, he was bringing an army. At least 20 riders, spread out in a wide, sweeping line, moving to encircle the small ranch. They were a wave of death, coming to wash away the last island of defiance. And riding just behind the front line, on a fine, white stallion that stood out like a shroud against the desert floor, was a man in a tailored black coat. He was watching the proceedings from a safe distance, a spectator to his own brutal theater. "Vance," Lida breathed, her voice a mixture of pure hatred and cold dread. Elias Vance had come in person to watch his final victory. There were no more words, no more ultimatums. The time for talking was over. The first shot came from Kane himself, a puff of smoke from his rifle, the bullet thudding into the wooden wall of the house with the sound of a hammer hitting an anvil. And then, the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from all sides, a deafening cacophony of lead and thunder. Bullets ripped through the thin wooden walls, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. The air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the whine of ricochets. But this was no longer a house of victims. It was a death trap. Jasper, positioned at the front window, took a steady breath and squeezed the trigger of his Winchester. One of Kane's men, a fool who'd charged in too boldly, spun around and dropped from his saddle. The first blow was struck. Sheriff Cole, a man transformed from a calm lawman into a seasoned gunfighter, fired his own rifle from the side window. Another rider fell. The initial charge faltered, the hired guns realizing this was not the easy slaughter they had been promised. They took cover behind rocks and the skeletal remains of the burned-out barn. The siege began in earnest. This was no longer a simple shootout. It was a battle of wits and will. Kane's men laid down a withering field of fire, trying to pin them down, to make any movement impossible. But they hadn't counted on the Apache. Lida, Amia, and Cora were not cowering. They were fighting. They moved through the darkened house like ghosts, phantoms of vengeance. Amia, armed with the Colt, appeared at a back window. Crack! A man trying to sneak around the side of the house cried out and clutched his leg. Crack! Another shot drove a second man back into cover. Lyda had found a bow and a quiver of arrows in the sheriff's saddlebag. She moved to a narrow slit in the wall, a place Jasper had overlooked. There was no loud report, only the soft thrum of the bowstring and the whisper of a feathered shaft. A man hiding behind the well suddenly stiffened, an arrow protruding from his throat, a look of shocked disbelief on his face as he slid to the ground. Cora, the youngest, the one who had seemed the most fragile, became their eyes and ears. She darted from one peephole to another, her voice a low, urgent whisper. Two men by the rocks, to the left. One is reloading near the dead horse. Her knowledge of the terrain, of the subtle shifts in shadow and light, was more valuable than a dozen guns. The ranch became a deadly maze. The ground Jasper had bought for $35, he now paid for in blood and gunpowder. The hired guns were professionals, but they were fighting for money. The people inside the house were fighting for their lives, for their past, and for the chance at a future. Their desperation was a weapon, and it was sharper than any blade. An hour passed. The sun beat down, baking the blood that was beginning to stain the dry earth. 3 more of Kane's men were down. But the relentless barrage of bullets was taking its toll. The house was being torn apart around them. Sheriff Cole took a piece of shrapnel to his arm, but he gritted his teeth, tore a strip from his shirt, and tied it off without a word. Then, Kane made his move. Under the cover of heavy fire, he and 3 of his men made a desperate charge for the front porch, intent on breaking down the door and ending the fight in a storm of close-quarters violence. "They're coming!" Cora screamed. Jasper met the charge. He kicked over the heavy table barring the door, aimed his Winchester, and fired straight through the splintering wood. A scream from the other side told him he'd found his mark. The door shuddered as bodies slammed against it. But it wasn't enough. Malachi Kane, a man fueled by pure, remorseless rage, kicked the weakened door off its hinges. He burst into the room, his face a mask of fury, his 6-gun blazing. The world devolved into a chaotic blur of smoke, noise, and death. Jasper fired his last round from the Winchester and dropped it, drawing his Colt. Sheriff Cole fired from the side, taking down one of the men behind Kane. Amia fired from the back of the room, her bullet catching another in the shoulder. But Kane was a demon. He ignored the chaos, his flinty eyes locked on only one target: Jasper. He lunged forward, his gun empty, drawing a long, wicked-looking knife. He was a cornered wolf, intent on taking his enemy down with him. The 2 men crashed together, a brutal, desperate struggle of muscle and steel. They slammed against the wall, overturning furniture. Kane was wiry and fast, his knife slashing, cutting a deep gash across Jasper's arm. Jasper, fueled by a righteous fury, fought back with the raw strength of a man with nothing left to lose. He landed a punch that sent Kane staggering back. For a split second, they were separated. Both men were gasping for air, their chests heaving. Kane raised his knife for a final, killing lunge, but in that second, Lyda stepped out from the shadows. In her hands was not her bow, but one of the sharpened spears they had made. Her face was calm, her eyes ancient and cold. With a powerful cry that was both a lament and a war chant, she drove the spear forward. It struck Malachi Kane square in the chest with a sickening thud. He froze, a look of utter shock replacing the fury on his face. He looked down at the wooden shaft protruding from his body, then up at Lyda. He opened his mouth to speak, but only a gurgle of blood came out. He crumpled to the floor, the devil's shadow finally extinguished. The sudden silence was deafening. The remaining hired guns, seeing their leader fall, lost their nerve. They began to fall back, firing sporadically as they retreated. And then, a new sound, the thunder of hooves, a large group of riders, appearing over the ridge. For a heart-stopping moment, Jasper thought they were Vance's reinforcements. But at the head of the group rode a man wearing the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. Sheriff Cole, bleeding but smiling, looked out the broken doorway. "Looks like my message got through after all," he said. The marshals descended on the ranch, rounding up the last of Kane's scattered men. And they rode straight for the man on the white stallion. Elias Vance sat frozen in his saddle, his face a mask of disbelief. His perfect plan, his entire world, had just been shattered by one stubborn rancher and 3 Apache women who had refused to die. His reign of terror was over. The battle was won, but the war for justice has just begun. The fall of Malachi Kane was just the beginning. Comment the number 7 if you felt that final, desperate stand. Vance is in chains, but can the law truly tame the wildness of the West? The sudden silence was the first thing Jasper noticed. It was a heavy, ringing silence, the kind that comes after a storm of gunfire. It was filled with the ghosts of echoes, the smell of burnt gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. Elias Vance, stripped of his power and his arrogance, was led away in irons by the marshals, his face a mask of cold, impotent fury. The ledger, that damning book of sins, was now evidence. The truth had finally found its voice. In the days that followed, the story of the stand at the Thorn Ranch spread like a wildfire across the territory. With Vance's power broken, the fear he had cultivated for years began to crumble. One by one, other settlers, other victims, found the courage to step forward, their voices adding to the chorus of condemnation. Lida, Amia, and Cora stood before the federal judge in Red Mesa, not as victims, but as warriors. They spoke for their father, for their elders, for every life Vance had destroyed. Their testimony, backed by the sheriff's ledger, was the final nail in his coffin. Justice, slow and scarred, had finally arrived. They returned to the ranch a week later. It bore the deep, ugly wounds of their war. The house was riddled with bullet holes, the door was a splintered ruin, and the ground outside was stained with the memory of the fight. The air itself seemed heavy with what had happened there. It was a place of death, a place of violence. It should have been a place to abandon, but to the 4 people who stood looking at it under the vast, indifferent Arizona sky, it was something else entirely. It was the place they had survived. It was the ground they had held. It was the home they had earned. Without a word, they began to work. Jasper, his arm bandaged but his spirit whole, began to pry the splintered boards from the windows, letting the clean, bright sunlight flood into the dark rooms for the first time. He found a quiet strength in the simple act of rebuilding, of mending what had been broken. He watched as Cora, the girl who had trembled in fear, gently tended to the small patch of earth by the well. She used a sharpened stick to turn the soil. Her hands, once frail, now sure and purposeful, she was planting seeds she had carried with her. A tiny, defiant act of life in a place that had seen so much death. He saw Amia, her fierce anger now tempered into a protective strength, working with Sheriff Cole to repair the fence line. Her hands, which had learned the cold weight of a colt, now learned the familiar work of stretching wire, of setting posts, of defining a boundary that was no longer a cage, but a sanctuary. And then there was Lida. She had retrieved the 3 pieces of the map, and with the help of the sheriff, had cleared the well, unblocking the channel to the living water. The spring, once a secret to be hoarded, was now a source to be shared. The water that flowed was cool and clear, washing away the blood from the dust. One evening, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of deep crimson and gold, Jasper stood on the porch he had defended. The house was still scarred, but it was clean. The air smelled of fresh-cut wood and damp earth. Lida came to stand beside him. They watched the sunset in a comfortable silence, the silence of people who had been through the fire together and had come out the other side. "You did not find the peace you were looking for, Jasper Thorne," she said softly, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. Jasper looked out at the land, at the 2 younger sisters laughing as they carried a bucket of water between them. He thought of the ghosts he had carried for 8 long years, the ghosts of his wife and daughter. They were still with him, but now they were quiet. Their whispers were no longer of failure, but of pride. "No," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "I didn't. I found something better." He had come to this place with $35, seeking an ending, a place to let his soul die. Instead, he had found a reason to live. He had found a purpose, not in running from the past, but in building a future. They were a strange, patchwork family, a broken man and 3 orphaned women, their lives stitched together with threads of violence, grief, and courage. They were survivors, all of them, but now they were something more. They were pioneers of a new life. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the mountains, a gentle breeze rustled through the valley. It was the land itself breathing a sigh of relief. This place, Ndenawas, the land of living water, had been scarred by greed and hatred, but it had been redeemed by compassion. It was a testament, written in blood and courage and hope, that even in the harshest corners of the Wild West, the most powerful force wasn't a gun or a fistful of gold. It was the simple, stubborn refusal of the human heart to stop fighting for the light. From a place of death, they are building a new life. A powerful end to a brutal chapter. What part of their story moved you the most? Comment the number 8 with your final thoughts on Jasper and the 3 sisters. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you on the next Wild West story. Jasper Thorne's story reminds us that true peace isn't found by running from our past, but by finding a purpose worth fighting for. It teaches that our deepest strength is often revealed not in saving ourselves, but in standing for others. Even when we feel broken, a single act of compassion can be the first step to rebuilding a life and turning a place of sorrow into a home. This is a powerful lesson that the family we choose can be the one that truly saves us. If tales of courage and redemption resonate with you, make sure to subscribe for more stories from the heart of the Wild West.